they shot down our drone. What should our answer be?
Well, we should hold them accountable and say that if you ever get near another U.S. set flying in international waters, your airplane would be shot down. What would Ronald Reagan do right now? He would start shooting Russian planes down if they were threatening our assets.
This is my first video update from Athens, Greece on this Wednesday morning. Let's talk about some news. And let's talk about this MQ-9 Reaper drone that was downed over the Black Sea yesterday. And we have two different narratives as to how this happened. We have the U.S. narrative, which says that Russia took down this drone with fighter jets by pouring fuel on this drone and then clipping its propeller, leading to the drone crashing down into the Black Sea. That is the U.S. narrative, and the U.S. claims that this was a reckless provocation. A very unprofessional is the words that they use, an unprofessional provocation from the Russian military. And then we have the Russian Ministry of Defense. They claim that they used fighter jets to bring down this drone, but there were no weapons that were used, and they brought down the drone with tactical maneuvers, and the drone was flying very close to Crimea. Now, obviously, this drone, this Reaper drone, was operating in the Black Sea to pick up surveillance. I think that's crystal clear. It was flying close to Crimea in order to pick up some intel or some surveillance on Crimea for some sort of possible attack or strike or who knows what against Crimea, perhaps for the big spring counteroffensive. So this drone was picking up intel. This U.S. drone, thousands and thousands of miles away from the United States, flying in a war zone off the coast of Russian territory, picking up intel that it would later pass off to NATO and to the Ukraine military, and that intel would be used in order to launch some sort of an attack or some sort of strike against Crimea. That's what the drone was doing. That's what the drone was doing, hovering off the coast of Crimea. And why do I say that it was off the coast of Crimea? I think it was closer to the Russian side of the Black Sea and close to Crimea, because the story is that when this drone went down, the U.S. called on the Romanian military to get out there and to pick up the drone before the Russians picked it up. And the Romanian military, they couldn't get to the drone in time, and the Russians got to it before they could. And so now the Russians have this drone tech, right? And that's the worry of the United States. John Kirby, the U.S. State Department official, he said that this is U.S. property, and he's very worried about the drone technology getting into the hands of the Russian military. Well, if you're worried about U.S. property getting into the hands of the Russian military, perhaps you shouldn't fly your drones close to Crimea in a war zone. Just a thought. But the fact that the Russians got to the drone so quickly before Romania could, to me, signals that the drone was most likely much, much closer to the coast of Crimea than it was to say, the coast of Romania. That's why I say that this drone was close to Crimea and was surveilling, getting intel on Crimea. So that's the drone narrative. Der Spiegel, they came out with an article saying that most likely this drone is just going to be chalked up as some sort of, this drone incident will be chalked up as some sort of accident, and that'll be that. But no doubt the collective West is going to use this drone incident to further escalate the conflict in Ukraine. They're going to use this drone downing as a way to push for more weapons and more money to the Zelensky regime, as are various neocon politicians and political elite decision makers. They're going to make the case that Russia aggressively shot down a U.S.-made drone, unmanned. There was no one actually died in this incident. A drone, a machine, fell into the Black Sea. So there was no fatalities, nothing like that happened. But they're going to make the case that Russia is provoking and is shooting down U.S. Military equipment. So the U.S. needs to give more military equipment and more money to the Zelensky regime. That's going to be the narrative. That's how they're going to use this incident to push the narrative for further escalation. That's what the neocons are going to do. And you know, it's the U.S. that's at fault here. 100% the U.S. is at fault. Because way in the beginning of the conflict, the Biden White House, the Pentagon, they stated that they would not hand over Reaper drones or what's the other drone? I believe Ghost drones. They would not hand over these drones to Ukraine out of fear that Russia would eventually shoot down one of these drones, and then Russia would be able to pick up these drones, reverse engineer it, and understand the tech behind it. That's what the U.S. military said way in the beginning of the conflict. They said no drones, none of our high-tech drones to Ukraine. And here they are flying one of their high-tech drones over the Black Sea, close to Crimea, trying to pick up intel that they can pass off to NATO and to the Ukraine military so that they can use this intel for their spring counteroffensive, or perhaps use this intel to launch some sort of kamikaze drone strike or something against Crimea. Who knows what this intel was going to be used for. But, if you're Russia and you see this drone hovering off the coast of Crimea, what do? You have to shoot it down. You have to take it down somehow, don't you? You don't know what this drone is doing. You don't know if this drone has weapons, if it's going to fire at you. You don't know if it's a kamikaze drone. I mean, you really don't have much of a choice other than to deal with a drone hovering off the coast of your territory, especially after you've had so many other drones that have tried to get into Crimea over the past couple of weeks and cause some sort of incident in Crimea, some sort of strike in Crimea. So you have to deal with this drone. I mean, Russia didn't really have much of a choice. The Russian ambassador to the U.S., he was called in to the State Department, Antonov, and he said that if this happened in the U.S., if there was like a Russian drone off the coast of New York, the U.S. would flip out. And he's right. He said, we consider this incident a provocation. That's what the Russian ambassador to the U.S. said. And he said, could you imagine what the reaction of the U.S. media or the Pentagon would be if such a drone would appear near New York or San Francisco? Yeah, the Russian ambassador to the U.S. is 100% correct. Can you imagine how the Biden White House, how the U.S., how the collective West media would flip out if there was a Russian drone hovering off the coast of New York? Or I don't know, maybe not a drone. How about if a weather balloon was floating off the coast of New York, or was traveling over the United States? What would be the reaction? Would the Biden White House use $1 million missiles to shoot down that weather balloon? Either way, this is going to be used by the war hawks and the warmongers to push for more escalation in Ukraine. Unfortunately, that's what they're going to use this incident for. So that is the story with with the drone, with this MQ9 Reaper drone. Let's now talk about regime change in Russia, according to the Canadian Foreign Minister, Melanie Joly. So the top diplomat for Canada, top diplomat, Melanie Joly, she said during an interview the other day that the goal of Project Ukraine is indeed regime change in Russia. That is what Canada's top diplomat said. And let me pull up her quote here. Foreign Minister Joly, a senior member of the cabinet of Prime Minister Trudeau, made her remarks as Canada has enacted new sanctions against the import of Russian aluminum and steel, outright mentioning the proposal of regime change. Quote, "We are able to see how much we're isolating the Russian regime right now because we need to do so economically, politically, and diplomatically. And what are the impacts also on society and how much we're seeing potential regime change in Russia," Joly stated to the National Post newspaper. "The goal is definitely to do that, is to weaken Russia's ability to launch very difficult attacks against Ukraine. We want to also make sure that Putin and his enablers are held to account," she added. Regime change. Once again, we're talking about regime change. And this is the top diplomat for Canada. Has someone told the foreign minister that their regime change, Russian economy in tatters, isolation plan is not working out so well? Has someone given her that memo? Maybe someone should tell Joly that Russia is not so isolated, not so isolated at all, and that Russia is selling a whole boatload on ghost ships, a boatload of oil and gas to India and China, and also to the EU and to the collective West on these ghost ships, and that the Russian economy is, according to the IMF, is heading for growth in 2023, or that Putin's popularity is at record highs. Maybe someone should tell the foreign minister what's really going on. Or maybe someone should tell the foreign minister that the collective West is pretty much in recession. Pretty much all the countries of the collective West are heading towards some sort of a recession. Banks are closing. Got a banking crisis. You have a diplomatic crisis because you have China mediating and negotiating peace in the Middle East between Saudi Arabia and Iran. You have Assad, who's going to be in Moscow, who is in Moscow right now. And they're preparing the way for Assad to meet with Erdogan and to get some sort of diplomatic resolution with the conflict in Syria, rapprochement between Turkey and Syria. This is happening right now, today. How about that for a diplomatic win? But it's Russia that's isolated. It's Russia that's isolated. It's the Russian economy that's in tatters. Regime change in Russia. Every time one of these collective West leaders talks about regime change, Putin must go, Assad must go, the Russian economy is in tatters. Name me one leader that wants to be Xi Jinping. Name me one. Every time they come out with these ridiculous statements, it always comes right back around to bite them in the you know what. I won't say it because I'm at St. Catherine's Orthodox Byzantine Church built in the 11th century. Beautiful little church. But yeah, every time they make these statements, it always comes right back around to get them. You want to know what country is going to have a regime change? It's not going to be Russia. It's going to be Canada. Trudeau government. Trudeau's the one that gets heckled when he gives speeches or when he walks around in Canada. He's the one that gets heckled, not Putin. Trudeau. What did Trump say to Tucker Carlson's questionnaire with regards to the conflict in Ukraine? He said that the only regime change that's needed is a regime change in the U.S. That's what Trump said. So Tucker Carlson, he passed out a questionnaire to Republican presidential candidates or presidential hopefuls, and he passed it out to Trump and DeSantis, Chris Christie, Mike Pence, Kristi Noem, who else? Nikki Haley. He passed it out to all of the Republican hopefuls for 2024. And most of them responded. Nikki Haley didn't respond to the questionnaire because she's a neocon, and we already know what her policy is going to be towards Ukraine. But basically, Tucker, he asked the presidential hopefuls what they think of the conflict in Ukraine, what they would do if they're president, what's their stance on regime change in Russia, sanctions, escalation in Ukraine, all of these things he asked them. And for the most part, most of the Republican presidential hopefuls, they responded to this questionnaire from Tucker Carlson. And Trump's response was, we don't need regime change in Russia. We need regime change in the United States. And for that, I say, regime change in Russia? No. How about regime change in Canada? That's what's coming. That's what's coming. So yeah, that was Trump's response to this questionnaire. DeSantis, he said that the U.S. has no business in this dispute. He called it a dispute between Russia and Ukraine. He said that if he was president, the United States would work for peace, to find a peaceful solution to this dispute, this regional dispute. And this really upset the Zelensky regime in a big way. It upset them to the point where the foreign ministry of Ukraine, they actually invited DeSantis to visit Kiev and to see for his own eyes that this is not a dispute and that this is a war and a conflict. And should DeSantis become president, well, DeSantis would need to support Ukraine for as long as it takes to give Ukraine money and weapons. So they actually extended an invite to DeSantis to visit Kiev. I don't think DeSantis is going to accept that invite. I don't think he would make that kind of a mistake to accept an invite and visit Zelensky. Ron DeSantis, you need to visit Kiev. You need to come here. Come here, meet with me, and you will see for your own eyes, with your own eyes, you will see with your own eyes that this is not a dispute. This is a conflict. This is a war. So I invite you, Governor DeSantis, to come to Kiev and to meet with me. And before you come to Kiev, Mr. DeSantis, I hear Florida's very rich state. Can you bring me a couple of $1 billion? I want to buy some homes in Miami. Just $3 billion so I can buy some homes in Miami. Thank you. That would be the invite to DeSantis. But Mike Pence, he responded and he said that he would, crank things up. He said he would go to World War III levels with Ukraine, and Chris Christie said the same thing. Kristi Noem, the governor of South Dakota, she gave an interesting response. Actually, she gave a very good response. She talked about how Project Ukraine has isolated the United States, has put the U.S. petrodollar, the U.S. reserve currency, in the U.S. dollar reserve currency in jeopardy, and that this is hurting the international standing of the U.S. and the U.S. Reserve currency status, and that was an interesting response from Kristi Noem. She said that sanctions do not work, and the sanctions have actually united the countries that are sanctioned to unite against the United States, which is something that we've been saying at this channel on the Duran. We've been saying this for a while now, that the US and the EU have sanctioned so many countries and so many people that they've actually created an entire block of countries, the sanctioned countries, a club of sanctioned countries that are now united and working towards the demise of the US dollar, of the US reserve currency. I mean, the sanctions, that's what the sanctions have done. They've actually brought countries together. They've brought more countries together than they have isolated countries. And the governor of South Dakota, she actually pointed this out, as did the New York Post in an article that they put out the other day. They said the same thing. The New York Post put out an article. Let me find it. I think I bookmarked it. Of course, the New York Post said that the U.S., they have to support Ukraine for as long as it takes, blah, blah, blah. But they actually put out an article with the title, Why the U.S. Dollar Has Become an At-Risk Currency. And in this article, they talk about how the U.S. has sanctioned so many countries that it's now put the U.S. dollar at risk of not being the reserve currency, because all of these sanctioned countries have now formed the multipolar world order. How about that? Isn't it funny how that works out? So that was the statements from these U.S. Republican presidential hopefuls, and the statement from Canada's top diplomat, Melanie Joly. Regime change in Russia. She sealed the fate of the Trudeau government by making that statement. Regime change is coming to Canada. That is now a guarantee. Let's now talk about, what should we talk about? Since we're talking about regime change, here's an update on what's going on in Georgia with the regime change in Georgia. There's news that you're getting an anti-protest forming in Georgia. In other words, you have Georgian citizens who are now coming out to the streets, and they're protesting against the regime change protests. And there were reports that, actually video, not even reports, I've seen the video of Georgian citizens in Tbilisi. They took down an EU flag, which was on the parliament building in Tbilisi. They tore it down, they burned it, and they placed a Georgian flag on the parliament building instead. And isn't that something? Isn't that something, to take down an EU flag from the Georgian parliament building and to put, I don't know, a Georgian flag on the parliament building? How about that? Anyway, there's video of these protesters in Tbilisi burning the EU flag, which I found interesting. Basically, they're trying to stop the regime change operation from succeeding, because they've understood that this regime change would lead to a catastrophe for Georgia. It would place Georgia on an accelerated path to becoming very much what Ukraine has become. And it would be accelerated because Georgia is a much smaller, much weaker, militarily weaker country than Ukraine was. Georgia hasn't had the 8 years of NATO weapons, money, preparation, and fortifications that Ukraine has had. And we're talking about a population of what, 4 million people, 5 million people. It's not a smart thing to do to provoke Russia. It's not necessary. You don't need to. You don't need to do this. And for what? For a foreign agents bill? Is that what this is all about? A foreign agents bill, which, by the way, Canada is passing a similar law, and the EU is now going to pass a similar bill as well. The European Union is considering passing a foreign agents bill as well. The same exact thing that the protesters in Georgia are on the streets protesting, the same bill that the parliament had to withdraw because the EU was pushing people onto the streets in Georgia to withdraw this foreign agents bill. The same bill is now being proposed by the EU technocrats and kleptocrats. The same bill. If an EU member state, NGO, university, charity, whatever it is, if it receives funding from a foreign actor, it has to report to that funding and it'll be categorized as a foreign agent. The EU is putting together the same bill that people in Georgia are protesting against, and the protesters are being sponsored and supported by the EU. And the EU is going to put the same bill to their parliament. They're going to enact the same bill. Incredible stuff. There's news that that the protesters in Georgia were actually, the students at least, were actually encouraged by their university professors to get out onto the streets. Teachers at Georgian universities offered students higher grades for participating in the protests. The use of universities for political purposes is the signature of Saakashvili's party, United National Movement. This was stated by the chairman of the ruling Georgian Dream Party, Kobakidze. So that's interesting. The protesters worked according to the American principles. They stood with a flag in front of the water cannon and brought flowers to the special forces, he added. That's interesting. If this is true, and this is not some sort of Russian propaganda or Russian talking point, it is coming from a politician of the ruling party. He's the one that made this statement. But if this is true, well, I think that's an interesting development. It sounds very reasonable to me. It sounds very logical. Why else would students be on the street protesting a foreign agents bill? What does a student care if an NGO has to declare in its financial statements that it receives money from a state actor? Is that reason for a student to get out on the street and protest? Of course not. Of course not. Now, if the university professor said, if you go out and protest, not only do you get a shiny EU flag free of charge, we'll give you this EU flag, but you'll also get a really good grade, well, then that might push students onto the streets. Anyway, I thought that was an interesting bit of news. Let's do one more story, and we will wrap this video up. Putin gave some comments on Nord Stream, and I think this is the first comments from Putin with regards to Nord Stream since the New York Times six people in a boat, Gilligan's Island SS Minnow story came out. And we're finally hearing from Russian President Vladimir Putin. And this is these are some of the things that Putin said when he was speaking to reporters. He said, on the involvement of the Ukrainian activists in the explosion of Nord Stream, he said, I am sure that this is complete nonsense. Explosions like those on the Nord Stream of such power at such depth can only be carried out by specialists supplied by a powerful state actor. He said the United States is theoretically interested in the terrorist attack in order to stop the supply of Russian energy to the European market and supply its own LNG, despite the fact that American gas is 25 to 35% more expensive. He said that Nord Stream has a future if the European partners of the Russian Federation revive their instincts of national interest. And he said that Russia proposed to form an international group to study the area where the Nord Stream pipeline was blown up and objects were discovered nearby, but the answer so far is uncertain, no answer. Russia is waiting for permission from Denmark to join the investigation into the new circumstances of the Nord Stream explosions. So those were Putin's comments in connection to the New York Times bombshell revelation that 6 guys on the SS Minnow, on the Andromeda, they blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. The Russian ambassador to the UN, Vasily Nebenzia, he said that Germany, Denmark, and Sweden have refused to cooperate with the prosecutor general's office and the FSB of Russia in investigating the sabotage at Nord Stream. Of course, they refuse to cooperate. That's the last thing they want, is for Russia to be involved in the investigation to uncover what happened in Nord Stream. Because for Germany, Denmark, Sweden, the United States, Norway, this is not about uncovering what happened to the Nord Stream pipeline. This is about covering up what happened to the Nord Stream pipeline. And let's do a clown world, and we'll wrap this up. My clown world today, I don't know if my clown world today is so good, but let's talk about it. It has to do with the UK government giving over 20 billion It has to do with the UK government giving £20 billion to the BBC to fight Russian disinformation. A one-time payment from the UK government to the BBC in order to fight Russian disinformation. How about that? There's a clown world for you. That's all I got today for my clown world. That's it. The UK government dishing out money to the state broadcaster to make sure that they stay committed to the state narrative. Russia bad, Putin evil, Zelensky good. That's what this 20 million is going towards. Anyway, that's the video, everybody. I'll leave it there. TheDuran.locals.com. We are on Rumble as well. And go to the Duran shop. 10% off. Use the code. Good day. Take care.